All right, hello. Brittany Silva here. We're going to talk about the two main waivers for adult Medicaid services through HCBS, SLS waiver and DD waiver. Next slide, please. So just an overview, we're going to briefly review waiver basics, the target criteria. We're going to talk a tiny bit about the wait list and what that process is, and then get into the nitty gritty of DD waiver versus SLS waiver, as well as discussing the residential options. And as a reminder, there will be a Q&A at the end of this. Next slide. So home and community-based services. From this point forward, I will just refer to it as HCBS. It just means these are services that are offered in the community or at home versus an institution setting. Next slide, please. So this is just showing, as you've already seen with Amy's presentation, where HCBS waivers are in terms of Medicaid supports. Next slide, please. There are 10 total HCBS waivers in the state of Colorado. 4 of those are offered through developmental pathways and through case management. Today, we're going to be talking about the main 2 adult waivers, which are developmental disabilities waiver and supported living services waiver. Next slide. This is just very briefly going over and reminding you guys what the eligibility criteria is for these waivers. There's a financial piece that's reviewed by the county. There's that level of care that we talked about with the 100.2 assessment. And then that target criteria that Anna mentioned with the developmental disability determination piece. So all 3 of those are eligibility factors for the 4 HCBS adult waivers. Next slide, please. Okay, transitioning from child to adult services. So individuals that are already on a children's Medicaid waiver like CES or CHIRP can choose to enroll into an adult waiver on their 18th birthday. This transition planning starts several months prior to that person's 18th birthday. So your case manager will be well aware of this before your individual turns 18. A year before they turn 18, so at 17, your case manager is already going to be aware of the transition. They're going to be reaching out and providing you with information about both the SLS waiver and the DD waiver. Specifically, we're going to be looking at like the targeting criteria and looking at kind of what the goals are going to be for that individual. And you're also going to be discussing like exploring guardianship or power of attorney, completing a disability determination if they haven't already completed that, as well as at 17 and a half, that is when your case manager is going to reach out and say, okay, now it's time to get a supports intensity scale, which Anna had mentioned earlier, that's when they're going to reach out and say, okay, it's time to set up a assessment for this supports intensity scale so that we can get the score. So they'll work on getting that scheduled and set up. You'll go through the assessment process. You'll get that support level score. And then also at 17 and a half, that's when we're going to be talking and you'll be meeting with your case manager to talk about what you want to do. When the individual turns 18, how would you like services to look like moving forward? So you're going to be discussing what the family caregiver option is, what that means for your family. And your case manager will give you a very nice, beautifully wrapped presentation about family caregiver option that really gets into the details about what that's going to look like for your family if that's something that you want to pursue. And that would be through the DD waiver. Another thing that you're going to be doing at that 17.5 mark is submitting an RFP or a request for proposal for residential services if you're wanting to move forward with the DD waiver. So not only are you going to be discussing, which waiver is going to be the right one for my individual? Is it going to be SLS? Is it going to be DD? That's kind of the big question. Which one do we want to choose? Once that decision is made, and your case manager can help you and give you materials and information to help you make that decision. But once that decision is made, that's when you're going to submit an RFP. If you're looking for DD waiver, that's when you're going to submit that RFP for residential services. Your case manager is going to fill out a person-centered profile that gives a ton of information, non-identifying, but information about that individual to see, you know, what agency is going to work best for you, depending on the type of services that you're wanting to access through the DD waiver. Then you're going to also start trying to collect documentation for that Social Security application that Amy had talked about in her earlier presentation. So lots of steps are happening all at once, but your case manager is going to be through every single step of the way to help you not only, you know, get the supports intensity scale interview conducted, getting that score, helping you decide, you know, what waiver you want to go in, and then doing that RFP process. Next slide, please. All right, next slide. So getting into the details about the 2 adult waiver services. Supported living services, otherwise known as SLS services, of course, is an adult waiver for adults over 18. This waiver allows you to be in your own home or family or within the community. Individuals that typically access this waiver are individuals that don't necessarily require a ton of 24/7 supervision support. So the thing that you want to know about this waiver specifically is there is not a wait list. So the DD waiver has a wait list. SLS does not. Services are prioritized by the needs assessment. So what that means is depending on the score for the supports intensity scale that that individual received, that is kind of how they base how much funding is provided for services for the whole year. So the score is like 1 through 6. If your individual has like maybe a score of 5 or 6, that just means that they have larger funds and access to get additional supports that are needed, because you're essentially trying to justify why this individual needs all the supports that they need. And another thing to note about the SLS waiver specifically is it does not come with any kind of residential piece. So it's just providing those supports and services within the community. Another big piece is this specific waiver offers professional therapies such as massage therapy, movement and/or music therapy, and hippotherapy. And this is really important to note because those specific services cannot be accessed through the DD waiver. So that's a really big thing to keep in mind when you're trying to decide, you know, what waiver is going to be right for me. And I've heard people ask, you know, what's going to be the best option for me? How do I know? You know, has anybody ever chosen SLS over DD? And the answer to that question is yes, they have. We see that if someone is getting like a ton of massage or they're really utilizing a lot of those professional therapies, then they might choose SLS over DD. And then that's a perfectly great option because that's what's going to work best for that individual at that time. Next slide, please. So this is just a list of all of the services that are available within SLS waiver. So you have access to assistive technology, you have access to behavioral services for 21 and older, day program, of course, where you're building those adaptive life skills, homemaker services. So that's when someone can come in and help that individual cook or clean, or training for those things. You have access to home accessibility adaptations, mentorship. So that is someone that can come in and help with that individual making decisions, helping them learn how to advocate for themselves, personal care. So that's assistance with daily living tasks, as well as pre-vocational services. And of course, those professional services that we listed, like massage, movement, and hippotherapy, including respite, specialized medical equipment, supported employment services, transportation, vehicle modification, vision and dental services are covered above what is covered over regular Medicaid. So anything that state plan Medicaid will not pay for, then you can get the waiver to pay for that, as well as consumer directed attendance services and supports, and transition services, which is a biggie. Next slide, please. So of course, the big one, developmental disability waiver. This waiver provides access to assistance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for each individual according to their own prioritized needs. So this is the one with the long wait list, the one everyone wants to get onto. How, you know, Anna mentioned, you know, how you get onto it. Some things to keep in mind is if you're already on a waiver, so if your individual is on a children's waiver like CES or CHIRP, then they automatically have a prioritized enrollment onto either DD or SLS waiver. That's not something you have to worry about. They already, because they're on that children's waiver, they have that prioritized enrollment and they can get on to either waiver that they choose. There's some other ways to get onto this waiver specifically, through like a regional center, a deinstitutionalization, through foster care transition or adoption. If there's an emergency criteria, so we do have a process called the emergency enrollment, which is like if it's an emergency and it's needed and it meets the criteria for that, then you can get on that DD waiver through that avenue, as well as if you're just on the waitlist status for as soon as available and your name happens to pop up, then you can get on it as well. Next slide, please. So these are all of the services that are listed within DD services, the big one being that residential piece. That residential piece being it provides for all daily care needs and supervision. So that is why everyone wants to get this waiver, is for that specific residential piece. And we're going to dig a little bit more into that and what that means in just a second, but just to kind of briefly overview the rest of the services that are also included, because you hear this a lot. When I was in active, that's a question I would get a lot from family members is, well, what's their responsibility? What are they responsible for in referring to that residential agency? In terms of the residential piece, that is what they are responsible for, and we're going to get more into that. But they are also responsible for transportation. They are responsible for helping get behavior services set up, ensuring that if they want to go to a day program, that they can get there. You can get, pre-vocational services, supported employment, transportation, transition services, all of that. The biggest difference between SLS and DD waiver is that professional therapy piece. So while SLS does offer those professional therapies like massage, music therapy, hippotherapy, those are 3 services you cannot access on the DD waiver. But on the other hand, with DD waiver, you do get that residential piece, which can be really vital for some of our individuals that need that 24/7 supervision and support. Next slide, please. So this is a list of what is all encompasses the residential services. So when you have residential listed on your DD waiver and you're getting that residential piece, this is what that means. They're responsible for providing self-advocacy training. So that might include training to assist in that individual, like expressing their personal preferences, like what do they want to eat for dinner? What do they want to do during the day? Also encouraging them to advocate for themselves and what they want and the choices that they make. That also includes independent living training. So that includes kind of like versus SLS, it encompasses that homemaker personal care piece where you're learning like how to do basic household services and chores like running the dishwasher and doing their laundry and cleaning, and learning those skills, as well as cognitive services. So that could include like money management, helping that individual learn how to budget and like make their, how to live and budget for their lives and figure out how they want to spend their money. Included in that is also the implementation of physical OT or speech therapy. So if that individual has like a PT plan where they're supposed to be doing physical therapy exercises outside of the home every week, that residential agency, or if it's a host home or whoever, they're responsible for ensuring that individuals actually doing those things and checking in with them and saying, hey, are you doing those exercises? Do we want to work on them together? That kind of thing. Another big piece of residential is the medical and healthcare services piece. That's really integral to meeting the daily needs of that individual. So that's including like routine medication administration and tracking that. Making sure if the individual needs support taking a bath and brushing their teeth in the morning, that they're getting that support that they need in the morning, as well as making sure that they're eating, they're doing what they want to do during the day and they're getting all of their needs met and living the life that they want to live. Some additional things that are encompassed within residential is the community access. So that residential piece is responsible for ensuring that that individual has access to explore their community if they want to. So if they want to go to the park and hang out with some friends, then it is that residential agency's responsibility that that person has access to be able to do that. As well as travel services. So providing and arranging transportation or even accompanying that individual to, you know, that doctor's appointment and helping them advocate for what they need, and being a support person for them, or anything else that's identified in the service plan that that individual needs support doing, that residential piece is going to be covered under that. And then the other main one is the supervision. So ensuring that the health and welfare of the individual is being provided through that supervision piece. If they cannot be left alone for more than, you know, an hour at a time or at all, then it is that residential agency's responsibility to ensure that there is someone in the home meeting that supervision need. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the options. Like, what does it look like when someone wants to live independently, if they want to stay with their parents, if they don't want to stay in the home, you know, are we going to go to a host home or are we going to go to a PCA, and what the difference is between those two. Next slide. So living independently. Obviously, you're living independently. This is someone that might not necessarily require access to 24/7 supports and services. And just some of the common services that are utilized for someone that wants to live independently is, you know, if they were on SLS, then some of the services they might use is homemaker, mentorship, and personal care. And those are going to be services that are going to help them ensure that their living situation is safe and clean, helping them make decisions. So if they need to go to their doctor, you know, maybe possibly going with them or helping them advocate for whatever they want to talk to that doctor about, as well as personal care services, making sure that they're taking care of themselves, and that kind of thing, including like budgeting, helping them meal plan, ensuring that they can go and you know, go to a grocery store and pick up what they need and successfully do that in a safe way. Another option, if you're wanting to live and stay at home, let's say your individual is turning 18 and they're not ready to leave yet, that's okay. They don't have to. And they don't have to choose one waiver or the other just because they want to stay at home. If they want to stay at home, but you're still leaning towards that DD waiver because of that 24/7 supervision and support needs, you can access what's called the Family Caregiver Act. And the Family Caregiver Act allows the individual to stay living within the home. And basically that primary caregiver, you're just going to choose a residential agency that you want to work with, and you basically become the paid provider, and you provide the supports and services that that individual might receive from, say, a host home provider or a staff member in a PCA setting. So if you're already providing those kind of supports to your kiddo or your young adult at home, when you choose the Family Caregiver Act, you're essentially continuing to do that. It's just in a different way, and you're having to kind of change up how you're doing things because you might have to document a little bit more. And so there's a couple of things that you have to keep in mind when you're wanting to choose that Family Caregiver Act and move over to that. Next slide, please. So living in a host home or a PCA setting, we get this question a lot. Like, you see the words GRSS and IRSS, and I get this question all the time. What does that mean? It just means group residential support services or individual residential support services. And the main difference is if it's an individual residential support service and IRSS, it's just 3 or few individuals that are living in a setting at one time, versus GRSS, which is more of like the group home model. Next slide, please. So that's what we're talking about with GRSS and IRSS. So just to talk a little bit more, and can we go back to that previous slide? Thank you. A little bit more about PCA and group home and like what that means. To be honest, there aren't a lot of group homes out there anymore. What we're most often seeing are PCA settings or host home settings. So PCA setting is where 3 individuals are living in a home or an apartment setting, and typically that's with rotating 24/7 staff. Versus in a host home, it's usually 1 or 2 individuals that are living in a home with a support provider. And there can be up to 3 people living in that host home, but that's really an exception to the rule. And it's typically 1 or 2 people. The best scenario that we see are when like natural supports like parents or legal guardians are like teaming up with that host home provider and that residential program manager to help support that individual in services. And if you can get a good team going, you know, we have individuals that have lived with the same host home provider for years and they're part of the family and they go on vacations together, and you know, that parent or legal guardian or whoever is just as involved, but they get to be mom instead of provider. They get to do the fun stuff. And then the host home provider is providing that service. So the PCA setting can vary based on the individual need. Some PCAs, or what they're called personal care alternatives, they're just basically like residential homes with 3 people that are, you know, they have their own room and they have a shared space, like a shared living room and a shared kitchen, and then they have that on-site staffing. This is similar to the group home setup. This scenario is ideal for individuals who would benefit from like rotating staff or from additional social interactions with other people in services. So if they would kind of benefit from having like maybe 1 or 2 roommates with some rotating staff in place, then a PCA setting like that would be ideal. The other variation of a PCA setting is when an individual is living like in their own little apartment, and then they have on-site staff that are in the apartment building, checking in on them, you know, making sure they're taking their medication. This kind of PCA setting is best for individuals that really want that individual. They want to live independently, but they need a little bit more support than what SLS waiver can offer. So that would be like if SLS, you know, you're getting homemaker and personal care, but it's just not quite meeting the need, and that individual is still needing a lot more support, then this type of PCA setting would work really well for someone on the DD waiver. All right. Some things to consider when you're trying to decide what's going to be the best option for your young adult and what you want to do. So you're going to want to consider the supervision needs. Next slide, please. Sorry, getting a little ahead of myself. You're going to want to consider, you know, what that supervision is going to need. If the individual needs that 24/7 supervision, then a host home or PCA setting is going to be encouraged if they can't get that type of supervision with family living at home. So you're also going to want to consider the safety or behavioral concerns. If the individual doesn't like being around a lot of people, PCA setting's probably not going to be the best option. You know, then it might be better to do a host home type setting where it's just maybe them and like the host home provider, you know, that might be better for them. But you also want to consider the safety concerns with staffing. Some individuals do not do well with one staff person. They kind of can become fixated on that person, and it really can work out better for them to have more rotating staff. And in that case, then, yeah, of course, you would want to look at more of a PCA setting where the staff is rotating and changing. Another thing that you're going to want to consider is your own capacity as a caregiver and what you can realistically offer support for that individual staying in the home. You know, can you provide 24/7 supervision and support? And if you can't, are you okay with people coming into your home and providing it for you? Like, say you're doing DD waiver family caregiver option, but you don't want to provide all the supports. You can have someone come in and provide some of those for you. Are you okay with that? You know, how do you feel about people coming in and out? How do you feel about, like, if you were on SLS, that lots of different providers kind of coming in and out. But most importantly, you want to consider what that young adult wants for themselves. Do they want to try to live independently? Or, you know, how do they feel about living in a host home? Or how do they feel like staying at home and what that's going to look like for everyone? As well as like the capacity of like, can they live in a PCA setting with other individuals, or is that going to be the best option for them specifically? So lots of things to consider when trying to choose what waiver is going to be right for that individual. Some things to keep in mind is you can choose SLS, but you can't, you know, if you choose SLS for your waiver, you can't go over to DD after you choose it. but you could choose DD waiver. And if it did not work for you for whatever reason, you could move to SLS, if that makes sense. But I also want to put out there that there are things in place like emergency enrollments and things that you want to consider that you can change if needed, if the situation changes and you meet that criteria. So you're not just like dooming yourself if you're choosing SLS over DD because you want that professional therapy piece. If later on in life that individual does need that 24/7 support, then that's something that you and your case manager can definitely talk about looking at doing later on in life. So it can change based on those needs and the eligibility for that criteria.